She was just another face in the crowd, or so it seemed. But make no mistake, this is not a story about fitting in. This is a story about standing out, not because of a uniform or a title, but because of the color of your skin and the quiet strength that refuses to bow. If you believe that dignity is not up for debate and that justice should not come with a condition, then stay and witness what happens when a system built to protect becomes a weapon instead. And before we begin, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in her place? Drop your thoughts in the comments we read, everyone. The international terminal was a blur of travelers and tension, like an orchestra tuning up for the chaos of boarding. At gate B12, the flight to Chicago buzzed with activity families, rechecking passports, business people scrolling through emails, the occasional cry of a tired toddler rising above the intercom announcements. Among them stood Audrey Hayes. Elegant yet understated Audrey exuded calm intelligence. Her black slacks were neatly pressed, her vest tailored but modest. Her shoes were low-heeled, functional but refined. No flashy jewelry, just a smart watch on her wrist and a well-made leather bag beside her suitcase. She wasn't there to make a statement, yet her mere presence did. She was focused, flipping through legal briefs on her tablet, immersed in thought. The only thing setting her apart, aside from her grace, was her solitude. No assistant, no security, just a woman flying home after 3 grueling days at a federal legal conference. But to someone else in that waiting area, Audrey Hayes wasn't simply another passenger. To Mrs. Abigail Prescott, a woman dripping in designer accessories and entitlement, Audrey's presence was an affront. She kept glancing at her with thinly veiled disdain. Her diamond-laden arms crossed her lips, twisted in irritation. And then she whispered, not so quietly, something about times being crazy and anyone getting priority these days. She couldn't stomach the idea that this black woman was standing in the same business-class line as her. And so with a sniff of self-importance, Prescott marched to the gate agent. "Hey you," she snapped. "Why do I have to wait with those people?" She tilted her head subtly toward Audrey. "She's been watching my luggage. Looks suspicious. You should check." The young gate agent hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, she's a priority passenger, just like—" But Prescott cut her off. Raising her voice, making a scene. Her complaints were baseless but loud, and in places like airports, loud often wins. 2 airport police officers, Riley and Baxter, patrolling nearby, noticed the commotion. Prescott's eyes lit up. She turned to them suddenly, all softness and concern. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. That woman," she pointed, "I don't feel safe flying with her. Something's off." Hayes looked up from her tablet, brows furrowed as the 2 men approached. Officer Riley was older, with a hardened face and the look of someone who'd long ago replaced doubt with prejudice. Baxter was younger, but more volatile. They walked toward Audrey with purpose, their stiff demeanor already signaling judgment. "Ma'am," Riley said flatly, "we need to speak with you." Audrey blinked, taken aback. She looked past them toward Prescott, who now stood smug and silent. She knew this wasn't about security. This was about race. This was about power. She stepped out of line. "What's this about?" she asked calmly. "We've had a complaint. Suspicious behavior. We need to see your ID and boarding pass." She handed them over without hesitation. "Everything's valid," she said, her voice even. "Now tell me what exactly is suspicious about standing in line and minding your own business." Baxter bristled. "Why so many questions? That attitude's suspicious enough." Riley examined her documents, then glanced up with a sneer. "Business class," he scoffed. "What do you even do?" Audrey's silence was sharp as a blade. Then she replied, "What I do is none of your business. What you're doing right now, that is." She looked each officer in the eye, unwavering. "I am a U.S. citizen. I have rights, and I demand to be treated with dignity, not suspicion." But dignity in the eyes of men like these was a threat, and they were about to show just how far they'd go to put her back in her place. The air around them shifted. You could feel it. Officer Baxter's nostrils flared. Officer Riley's face tightened. For men used to compliance, especially from people like her, Audrey's calm defiance was an open challenge. And they didn't like to be challenged. What Baxter snapped, stepping closer. "You think you can talk to us like that? We're the ones asking the questions here." He looked her up and down. his expression turning from scrutiny to disdain. Or is this what they teach in law school now, how to mouth off to police? Audrey didn't blink. Her posture didn't waver. But inside she felt the weight of a lifetime's worth of these encounters. She had worked too hard for too long to be dragged down by the petty egos of two small men hiding behind badges. But she also knew how dangerous that combination could be. "I've complied," she said firmly, "and I've asked for your names and badge numbers." "That is my right. You don't get to make demands," Riley shouted suddenly. His calm mask cracked his voice, booming over the murmurs in the boarding area. Passengers froze, heads turned, phones were lowered. For a moment even the airport announcements seemed to hush. And that's when Riley said it. "You impudent black woman," he snarled. "Don't forget who you're talking to." There it was. The truth behind the confrontation laid bare. Gasps rose from nearby travelers. A mother covered her child's ears. The gate agent's face went pale. But neither officer cared, they were too deep in it now. Power and anger had taken over. "You think your fancy clothes and business class ticket mean anything?" Baxter hissed. "You think you can talk back to law enforcement and just walk away?" He stepped closer, his chest puffed, his fists clenched. "You're not flying today. You're lucky if you're not behind bars." Audrey stood still, her voice low but unwavering. "Enough," she said. "You've crossed the line. Your behavior is not only discriminatory, it's unlawful. You are violating my civil rights, and I promise there will be consequences." But her warning only enraged them further. "Oh, there'll be consequences, all right," Riley barked. "Let's see how much you know about rights when you're in handcuffs." And with that, the unthinkable became real. Baxter lunged forward, grabbing Audrey's wrists with brutal force. She gasped, not from fear, but from the sharp pain, as her arms were yanked behind her back. "Let go of me," she protested, her voice ringing clear across the terminal. "You have no cause," but Riley nodded, waving off the stunned gate agent who tried to step in. "We're detaining her for disturbing public order," he said, inventing the charge as he spoke, "and for resisting police instructions." The handcuffs clicked shut, cold metal slicing into Audrey's skin. The crowd watched horrified, some recording, others frozen by fear or disbelief. An accomplished black woman being treated like a criminal for nothing, for standing in line, for existing with pride. Prescott stood off to the side, arms crossed, smirking with a twisted satisfaction. They had given her what she wanted, humiliation. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this moment, this injustice, would not end in silence. Because Audrey Hayes was not just another traveler, and they were about to discover the depth of their mistake. The walk to the airport police station was slow, heavy, like a parade of disgrace orchestrated by ignorance. Audrey Hayes, wrists bound by steel and arms aching, walked not with shame, but with a posture molded by years in courtrooms where injustice was dressed in rules and cloaked in titles. People parted like water before her, but their silence was thunderous. A few stared in disbelief. Others lowered their eyes, unwilling to confront the ugliness unfolding in front of them. A child asked her mother why the lady was being arrested. The mother said nothing. Behind her, Officer Baxter strutted with inflated pride. Riley followed his eyes, still burning with power-drunk rage. To them, this was victory, order, restored authority asserted. But Audrey, she was memorizing every face, every camera, every word spoken. Inside the small airport precinct, a windowless, grey-walled holding area tucked behind the duty-free shops. They processed her like a suspect. Not like a woman, not like a human being. A clerk took her name, her address, her date of birth. Then came the question that shifted the earth beneath their feet. Occupation, the clerk asked. The officers snickered, arms folded. They waited to hear teacher or consultant, something they could mock. Audrey raised her head. Her eyes, clear and unwavering, met the clerk's. "I am Chief Judge Audrey Hayes of the United States Court of Appeals." Silence fell like a dropped gavel. The clerk blinked. "Chief, Judge," he echoed, his voice cracking. She nodded once. The air in the room changed. The mocking vanished from the officers' faces like a vanishing spell. Riley's smug expression melted into horror. Baxter's body stiffened, then trembled. The color drained from both their faces. The weight of what they had done descended all at once, too fast to process, too heavy to deny. They hadn't just humiliated a black woman. They had unlawfully arrested a federal judge, one of the most powerful legal minds in the country. And now their careers, their freedom, their lives as they knew them, hung by a thread they had just lit on fire. Riley stumbled backward, mumbling incoherently. Baxter dropped to his knees. "Judge Hayes, we didn't know," Riley stammered. "We're sorry, please, Your Honor. This was all a misunderstanding." Tears welled up in Baxter's eyes. "Please forgive us. We were misled. We were just doing our job." But their voices, pleading pitiful, could not erase what had already happened. Audrey didn't flinch. Her face was composed, her silence more damning than any verdict. Finally, she turned to the clerk and said, "Remove these handcuffs. Now." The man scrambled to obey. As the metal loosened from her skin, deep red marks were left behind, a reminder of the moment the law was violated by those who swore to uphold it. "Now," she said, her voice level but piercing, "call the airport police chief. Call the U.S. Marshals. Call the chief of staff of the federal court. And do not keep them waiting." The clerk moved with urgency. Outside that small room, chaos was brewing, but inside a storm of reckoning had just begun. Within minutes, the airport's hierarchy began to tremble. Word spread like an electrical current snapping through wire. The chief judge of the United States Court of Appeals had been detained, handcuffed, insulted, degraded by two of their own officers. Not suspected, not escorted, detained, and the videos had already started surfacing. First came the airport police chief, face-pale stride, stiff with panic, followed by his deputies and senior security staff. Then agents from the U.S. Marshal Service arrived, expressions locked in steely professionalism, but their body language screamed alarm. They were trained to protect federal judges, not scramble after their mistreatment. The tension in the precinct was thick enough to carve. Chief Hayes didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence had already turned the precinct into a courtroom, and every officer in it into a potential defendant. She stood upright, despite the ache in her wrists, the trauma that clung to her skin like sweat. Next to her was the clerk from the federal court, called in at her request. With calm authority, she recounted everything, from the moment Abigail Prescott spewed her poison at the boarding gate to the insults, the accusations, the cold metal biting into her skin. The airport police chief listened in frozen silence, his career unraveling with each detail. And then, without hesitation, he made the first move. Effective immediately, he announced, "Officers, Dave Riley and Sean Baxter are suspended from duty pending a full internal and federal investigation. Their weapons badges and access credentials will be surrendered at once." The order hit the room like thunder. Riley and Baxter, just hours ago puffed with arrogance, now stood as empty shells. Their uniforms still fit, but they no longer meant anything. They were stripped of authority, of respect, of any hope of burying what they'd done. The chief wasn't finished. Internal Affairs will work directly with the FBI Civil Rights Division. All evidence, surveillance footage, body cam recordings, gate logs will be preserved and reviewed. We will also identify the civilian who initiated this complaint. That meant Abigail Prescott. She was no longer just a witness. She was a co-conspirator in what was now being investigated as a civil rights violation. If she was still in the terminal, she would be detained. If she'd boarded her flight, her name and flight details would be sent to authorities at her destination. But it wasn't just procedural. It was personal now. This wasn't about a mistake. It was about a system that allowed prejudice to hide behind policy. That turned uniforms into shields for misconduct. And today it was exposed in the most public way imaginable. Back in the holding room, Riley and Baxter sat apart, faces blank, eyes darting. Baxter looked like he hadn't taken a full breath in 20 minutes. Riley wiped sweat from his brow every few seconds. They knew what was coming. Across from them stood the woman they'd tried to reduce to a problem, now restored to her rightful form. Chief Justice Hayes, no longer a passenger, no longer a suspect. A reckoning in a black vest and leather bag. By nightfall, the airport was no longer just a transportation hub, it had become a federal crisis zone. The FBI Civil Rights Division, now officially involved, moved with calculated urgency. Investigators reviewed footage from every angle of Gate B12, syncing timestamps with body cam recordings, flight manifests, and bystander videos already circulating on social media. Within hours, the case had left airport jurisdiction entirely. It had entered the domain of national scrutiny, and the facts spoke louder than any defense. The footage was damning a calm, composed woman complying with every request, two officers escalating without cause, racial slurs captured in crisp digital audio. Witnesses were numerous, consistent, and clear. None of them supported the officers' claims. What made it worse, unforgivable really, was who the victim was. Judge Audrey Hayes wasn't just any federal judge. She was a leading figure on civil rights cases, a voice of integrity in some of the country's most divisive legal battles. To assault her so publicly, so brazenly, was not just an error. It was a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked authority. Prescott, meanwhile, had been located mid-flight. Her name, passport number, and allegations were waiting at her arrival gate like a welcome party she never asked for. Homeland Security detained her on the spot. At first, she was defiant, insisting she had only expressed concerns. But her confidence began to unravel the moment she was told the police she had misled were now testifying against her. Faced with the threat of federal charges for providing false information and inciting discriminatory action, Prescott's attorney began urgent negotiations. They knew jail time was on the table, and worse, Judge Hayes could file a personal civil suit that would annihilate Prescott's wealth and reputation. In exchange for avoiding prison, Prescott agreed to plead guilty to a lesser charge, pay a $500,000 fine, and issue a formal public apology. It was humiliating but far more merciful than what she'd helped unleash. Back at the airport, Riley and Baxter's descent continued. A joint press conference was held by the U.S. Marshal's Office, the airport authority, and federal investigators. No names were spared, no action softened. The message was uncompromising: abuse of power, especially when laced with racism, would not be tolerated. Not by this administration, not by this justice system, not anymore. Audrey Hayes watched from a private room as it unfolded. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat, because justice, when personal, never feels like triumph. It feels like exhaustion, like surviving something that never should have happened in the first place. But even so, she stood taller, the red marks on her wrists still visible, the sting of public disgrace still raw, but her resolve untouched, and the system that thought it could silence her now had to answer to her. The legal fallout arrived swiftly, precise as a judge's gavel. By the end of the week, both Riley and Baxter were officially terminated from the airport police force. Their dismissals were announced in a public memorandum signed by the Chief of Airport Security and endorsed by federal oversight officials. The language was clear: gross misconduct, abuse of authority, racial bias, and unlawful detention of a federal judge. But job loss was only the beginning. Given the overwhelming evidence and the national spotlight, the case had attracted the U.S. Attorney's Office announced formal charges: violation of civil rights under color of law, unlawful detention, and conspiracy to deprive rights. Each charge carried severe penalties, especially in a case involving a sitting federal judge. The trial was scheduled in a federal courtroom not far from where the injustice had taken place. Security was tight, the gallery packed. Reporters, legal observers, and members of the public filled every seat. The mood was heavy with anticipation, an unspoken understanding that this was more than a trial. It was a moment of reckoning. The prosecution's case was relentless. They laid out every second of footage, played every racist remark, and had each eyewitness testify, including airport staff, who admitted they had been too afraid to intervene. And then came Judge Hayes. She took the stand not as the chief judge, but as the wronged citizen. Her testimony was calm, unembellished, yet devastating. She described the fear not for her safety, but for what her mistreatment symbolized. "This was not about me," she said. "This was about the millions of people who do not wear a robe or carry a title, who face this kind of treatment every day and have no one to hear them." The jury deliberated for only 5 hours, guilty on all counts. When sentencing day arrived, the courtroom stood still. The presiding judge, a peer of Hayes from another circuit, looked straight at Riley and Baxter and said, "Law enforcement is entrusted with power. But power without integrity is tyranny, and tyranny has no place in a democracy." Each officer was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. Some said it was harsh, others said it wasn't nearly enough. But it was the maximum the court could impose, and it was a message carved in stone. As for Abigail Prescott, Her deal with prosecutors was sealed under the weight of potential prison time. In addition to the $500,000 fine, she was barred from serving in any official or advisory role for 10 years and required to complete over 1,000 hours of community work in civil rights education programs. Her public apology aired nationwide, scripted, stiff, and drenched in regret. She would forever be known not for her wealth or her social standing, but for her role in a moment of national disgrace. And Judge Hayes, she returned to the bench, not because she had to, but because walking away would have meant they'd won something more important than a courtroom battle. They would have taken her purpose, her fire. Instead, she sat down in her robe once again and got back to work, because the fight for justice doesn't pause for personal wounds. It continues in rulings, in reforms, and in the stories that refuse to be silenced. Some stories end with applause, others end in silence. But this one ends with a mirror held up to a society still wrestling with its own reflection. In the weeks that followed the trial, Judge Audrey Hayes became a symbol not of victimhood, but of the power of restraint, dignity, and unshakable principle. She granted no interviews, held no press conferences. She let the legal system speak through its verdicts, not its headlines. But within courtrooms across the nation, change began rippling. The Department of Justice issued new mandatory training protocols for all airport law enforcement agencies on racial profiling, civil rights, and escalation procedures. Federal funding for airport security programs was tied directly to those reforms. Officers would now be held personally and criminally accountable for discriminatory conduct, regardless of rank. In legal circles, Hayes's case was cited in law school classes and ethics seminars. Her name became shorthand for what happens when justice is tested in public. But she didn't want to be remembered for the day she was handcuffed. She wanted to be remembered for what she did next. And she never stopped showing up. Each week, she returned to her chambers the same way she always had: early, focused, prepared. She ruled on cases large and small, but always with the clarity of someone who had walked through fire and emerged not with vengeance, but with vision. One morning, as she arrived at the courthouse, a young black woman in a security uniform approached her, nervous eyes shining with something unspoken. "Ma'am," she said softly, "I just want to say, you made me believe I don't have to stay quiet when something's wrong." Hayes smiled, not out of pride, but out of purpose. "Then I did my job," she said, "and now it's your turn. Because justice isn't a person, it's a practice. It's not loud, it's consistent, and sometimes it walks through an airport quietly, just trying to go home until the world gives it no choice but to rise. So when you see injustice, remember this: speak, stand, persist, because silence never changes anything. But stories like this, they just might. If this story moved you even just a little, don't let it end here. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, stand up in the way that only you can. And if you believe that truth should never be silenced, hit that like button, subscribe, and come back tomorrow. Because we'll be here with another story that dares to speak, another voice that refuses to be ignored, another reminder that justice isn't just a courtroom. It's you.